It's one of the most unsettling mysteries in the United States. Here is the story of the Noguera Naso case, where a death row inmate peered into the darkness of another killer, and cold cases long forgotten began to stir again. A winter fog rolls in from the Pacific and coats the cliffs south of San Francisco. Waves slam the rocks. Up on the bluff, wind slices through the dunes near a ranger's outpost. It is January 4th, 1974. A young woman's body lies at the edge of Thornton Beach in Daly City, strangled and left where the wind never stops. Her name is Charlotte Cook. She is 19, a college student, a young mother, a daughter. The day before she did a brave thing, she went to court as a witness in a robbery case. Then she left home in Oakland to visit her sister in San Francisco. She never arrived. For decades, the answer to what happened on that cold gray shoreline would stay out of reach. And her name would one day echo inside a prison, carried by the voice of a very unlikely messenger. Years pass, headlines fade, but the thread that begins at that cliff keeps moving, winding through the Bay Area and far beyond, until it lands behind the walls of California's oldest prison. San Quentin sits on a point of land above the water, a heavy mass of stone and iron. Starting in late 2013, and in the years that followed, the prison held two men whose names would become linked in strange and haunting ways: Joseph Naso and William A. Noguera. Joseph Naso is old when he arrives. Born in 1934 in Rochester, New York, he's a drifter with a camera. People who knew him once called him Crazy Joe. He worked as a photographer. He lived in San Francisco in the 1970s, later in quiet Piedmont, then Sacramento, then Reno. He had a son who struggled with mental illness. He was still shoplifting in his 70s. To neighbors he could seem odd but harmless, almost invisible. But the case that followed him into San Quentin was anything but harmless. In 2013, he was convicted in Marin County of 4 murders: Roxane Rogash, Carmen Colon, in California, not the Rochester child with the same name, Pamela Parsons, and Tracy Tafoya. The detail that chilled so many was simple and strange. Each victim's first and last name began with the same letter: RRCCPPTT. That is why many called him the double initial killer. He was sentenced to death. Still, many questions remained. How many victims were there in truth? What did his private notebooks really mean? And how many names never even made it into those pages? The most infamous thing seized during the investigation that brought him down was a small handwritten list, impossible to forget once seen. In 2010, after a probation visit in Reno triggered by yet another shoplifting incident, officers opened drawers and boxes and found weapons, mannequins in lingerie, thousands of photographs, and the item that froze the room, a list of 10. Investigators called it that because the entries weren't full names, just hints: girl, and a place, a line or two, written like a code. Alongside the list were diaries packed with cold details and disturbing photographs of women posed like dolls. This didn't read like a regular journal. It read like a hunting log. Prosecutors argued the list marked out victims. 4 entries matched the 4 murders he was charged with and convicted of in Marin County. 6 others were unknown, or at least unnamed. Those fragments taunted everyone who searched them for meaning. The list was only part of the story. The man across from Naso on the tier at San Quentin was the other part. His name was William A. Noguera. He had been one of the youngest men sent to death row in California, convicted for a 1983 murder in Orange County. His life behind bars stretched over most of 4 decades. Over time, he changed, he studied, he made art. He watched the parade of men who cycled through death row, the violent, the broken, the famous, the forgotten. The system kept turning, he kept breathing, and when Joseph Naso arrived, the air in that place seemed to change. Noguera watched and listened. Over months and years, he did something almost no one expected. He got close to Naso. He earned the old man's trust. He became a mirror the killer used to admire himself, talk and brag. The 2 men formed a strange bond built on fear, ego, respect, and need. One man wanted to confess without ever really confessing. The other wanted to catch every word, write it down, and pass it to someone who could act. That is where the Noguera-Naso cold case begins. Not with the first murder, not with the famous trial, but with a conversation between 2 men in the most controlled building in California. The goal was never friendship. The goal was truth. It came out in bits and pieces like light through a keyhole. At first, Naso stayed vague. He bragged about his talent as a photographer and how women trusted him. He hinted that he had secrets no one would ever prove. He teased images no one would ever see. He spoke around the edges of his projects, as if murder were a hobby to curate. He used distance, time, and age as a shield. By his early 90s, a journalist would call him one of the most prolific killers in American history. Even then, he kept playing with words. The more he spoke, the more he revealed. The more he revealed, the more he needed to explain to keep up the act. Hold this beat. In any mystery, there's a moment when the ground shifts. This is one of those moments. Because Noguera didn't just listen, he wrote. He wrote everything down, hundreds of pages, dates, phrases, places, statements. Only the killer could know. He slipped this information to an investigator on the outside, a respected cold case detective named Kenneth Maines. The two men began to push the boulder uphill. They checked every small detail they could. They compared the hints Naso dropped with old police files that had gathered dust for years. Slowly, connections formed. One of those connections led back to the cliff above Thornton Beach. The name that surfaced was Charlotte Cook. In 1974, Charlotte's murder quickly turned cold. Her life was full, classes, a child, a strong desire to help. The day she died, she had stepped into a courtroom to support the law. That made her case stranger still. Some whispered that the robbery case put her in danger. Others felt the way she was killed, the belt around her neck, the control in the staging, pointed to a different kind of predator, one who had done this before. It was a theory, not a solution. Decades later, inside San Quentin's stone walls, the old man talked. He talked about a time, a place, an act that matched what the Daly City file held. Not a guilty plea, not a neat ending, a thread. And threads can pull a whole sweater apart. Officially, Charlotte Cook is still listed as an unsolved homicide. The thread doesn't change that. Yet. Another name surfaced from Naso's strange trust in the man across from him, Lynn Ruth Connes. Lynn disappeared in May 1976 in Berkeley. She was 20, bright, careful. She had been looking for modeling work. A man who called himself Jeff set up a meeting with her at a restaurant called Bateau Ivre on Telegraph Avenue. A waitress later told police a young woman who looked like Lynn came in at 10:15 a.m. The restaurant was closed, but the waitress let her sit and wait. After that, Lynn was gone. No one ever saw her again. Years later, the same pattern would appear again and again in Naso's life. Offers of photographs, the promise of a chance, a setup. Inside San Quentin, the old man began to write notes for the man he trusted, and one of those notes pointed to Lynn. It didn't end the case. It didn't find a body, but it gave shape to something that had been fog for half a century. It gave investigators a reason to look again. Hold another beat, a woman taken in broad daylight in a college town. A secret kept for nearly 50 years. A list written by a killer. A note slid across a prison tier. Letter by letter, as if the past itself were trying to speak. The work that followed was slow. It had to be. Noguera and Detective Maines compared words from a prison cell to car registrations, from the 1970s to newspaper archives on microfilm, to police notes in boxes that hadn't been opened in years. They checked birth dates and street maps. They tracked the rhythm of Naso's life, where he lived, where he worked, where he hunted. They matched that rhythm against disappearances with no answers. The pattern was there. The question was whether anyone could turn a pattern into proof. Another beat. When Naso's home in Reno was searched in the early 2000s and 10s, the diaries and the list of 10 shook the case loose. But the list didn't carry all the names. It couldn't. A killer changes his methods. He plays with rules he sets for himself. 4 of the victims tied to Naso in court had double initials, and the press couldn't resist the headline. But violence doesn't follow neat rules. Not every victim had a name that fit the theme. Not every crime left behind something that made sense. That is why so many cases stayed cold. That is how a petty thief and part-time photographer could move from city to city and be treated like a ghost. There were shadows behind that double initial label too. Some wondered if the pattern reached back to Rochester, New York, where a series of child murders in the early 1970s terrified a city. Those victims also had matching initials, and Joseph Naso had once lived in Rochester, but science cut through rumor. DNA didn't link Naso to the Rochester crimes. His known victims were adults. The Rochester victims were children. The stories sound similar, but the facts don't match. In the end, the Rochester murders remain their own terrible mystery. The hard facts about Naso are blunt. In 2013, a Marin County jury found him guilty of 4 murders. He represented himself at trial. He was sentenced to death. He was in his late 70s when the sentence came down. He would grow very old under a death sentence. His notebooks and photos, his list of 10, his history with a camera, his habit of finding women on the margins and posing them like mannequins, these are the reasons he's feared in memory as much as in life. But that isn't the end of the story, because a list of 10 isn't the truth. It's a prop. Truth is hidden in the lives of the women who never came home. This is where the case earns its name. The tie between the 2 men began in a place without mercy. And yet, what grew from that tie was a kind of mercy for families who had been waiting for someone to care. Over the years, Noguera built something more than a file. He built trust with the outside world. He connected with a detective known for bringing cold stories back into the light. Together, they pushed police in several cities to reopen or re-examine cases that had gathered dust. They shared information with reporters who could carry it farther. They handed names to people who had the power to act. Sometimes they found only heartbreak. Sometimes they found small wins, confirmations that a detail Naso gave matched something never reported, or a new witness who came forward after seeing a face in an article. The Charlotte Cook thread tightened: the date, the route, the cliff, the belt, the way the scene looked when the body was found, the overlap with places Naso liked to go. Old notes began to fit together like pieces of a picture that had been cut the wrong way. Investigators looked again, harder, with fresh eyes. They searched for people who might still remember a face, a car, a camera bag, a man who liked to talk about models. After so long, certainty was still hard to find. But the sense of direction was real. Official pages still list her as unsolved, and yet the new words from inside a prison gave shape to a path. The Lynn Connes thread did the same. The modeling ad, the man named Jeff, the meeting at Bateau Ivre, the time, the place, the silence that followed, the memory of a camera and a promise. When a note from a condemned killer points a finger, police don't stop their work. They start it again from scratch. That means long hours and careful steps. Old binders come off the shelves. Witnesses are tracked from one address to another, across states. In some cases, answers never come. In others, a missing page appears, and the story can finally be told. The hope in the Connes case is that the next page still exists, waiting in a file box or inside a memory that hasn't been called up in years. Another beat. Picture the tear at San Quentin after lights out, when voices drop and the steel hums. 2 men on opposite sides of a thin line keep talking. One tries to feel powerful by reliving his past. The other tries to take that power and turn it into justice. It's a grim dance, but it matters. What makes this story different is not only the pair at its center. It's the way an old case can find new life when people refuse to look away. A city website keeps a page of unsolved cases, and on that page is a name: Charlotte Cook. The date is there. The beach is there. The cause of death is there. A simple entry, but it keeps her in sight. In a national database of the missing, another name holds steady: Lynn Ruth Connes. The details about the meeting on Telegraph Avenue, the clothes she wore, the time of day, small facts that keep a story from slipping out of view. Those facts, combined with the words a killer spilled to the only person he trusted, are why this case has come back to life in recent years. In recent reporting, a journalist laid out how Noguera pieced these confessions together, and how Detective Maines checked them against the record. The work tied Naso not only to the murders he was convicted of, but to possible victims far beyond the 4 named in court. Some estimates reach 24 or more. That doesn't mean a courtroom will ever stamp those cases solved. It does mean families who have been waiting have new reasons to hope, and cold case units have new reasons to look. It also means the horrifying truth of one man's double life may be closer to the surface than anyone realized. Another beat, a knock on a door decades after a girl went missing. A mother's hands stop midair. A father leans forward before he lets himself breathe. The detective in the doorway is older now too, but he says a name that hasn't been said out loud at that table in a very long time. The room goes quiet as he talks about a list, about a prison, about a killer who wrote down things he never should have written. Hope is a hard thing to live with, but it's better than the void. It's important to face another hard truth about this case. The man who carried the stories outward from San Quentin wasn't an innocent bystander who happened to meet a killer. William Noguera took a life when he was very young. He was sentenced to death. He served more than 40 years. Courts later reviewed parts of his case. After a long legal fight, his death sentence was reversed. In 2024, he was paroled. He walked out a free man after spending most of his life in one place. He gives talks now and speaks about cold cases, about warning signs investigators should look for, about how predators hide in plain sight. People debate the idea of redemption, whether someone who did the unforgivable can do good later on. For some, that's too much to ask. For others, the work he has done on the Noguera Naso case and others like it is proof that even a broken life can help. What matters to families is that someone listened and someone cared enough to write it down. There are other names that swirl around Joseph Naso's history: a Bob Dylan fan who called herself Sarah Dylan, a Jane Doe found near a creek in wine country, other women whose lives ended far from home or whose names are known only to the people who loved them. Some of those stories surfaced at trial. Some exist only as rumor or as a line in a diary or a photograph in a box. A killer's ledger isn't a map to every crime. It's a collection of doors. The work now is to open each one and see what lies behind it, carefully, without losing sight of the people whose lives were taken. Today, Joseph Naso remains under a death sentence in California. The state has a moratorium on executions, and traditional death row housing has been dismantled, with the condemned inmates moved under new programs. The legal sentence still stands even as the system changes where and how they're held. But time doesn't change what happened. Time only asks whether people will keep looking. The Noguera Naso case isn't about giving a killer more attention. It's about using his need to talk to open doors that have been shut for too long. It's about Charlotte Cook, whose father had to identify her by the coat she wore. It's about Lynn Ruth Connes, who left home to meet a man for a modeling job and didn't come back. It's about the dozens of other names that might, one day, find answers, because someone who once harmed others decided to spend his last years behind bars trying to help. The story of the Noguera Naso case ends with a question. What is justice when so much time has passed? For some families, justice looks like a name written on a line that's been blank for years. For others, it's a place to visit, a marker set where there was nothing. For all of them, justice begins with attention. Attention brings pressure. Pressure brings movement. Movement is how cold cases finally thaw. This case is still open. The pain is still fresh for those who loved the women whose lives were taken. Anyone who hears this story can feel that. But an open case is also a call. It's a call to speak up if a detail rings a bell. It's a call to care about someone who was young and hopeful and deserved a full life. It's a call to keep saying their names out loud so they don't vanish into the fog.